Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and today we're going to be talking about, well, everything that we know about what's wrong with the Hubble telescope. Because as you might have heard from some of the other sources, since June 13th the telescope has been malfunctioning, and unfortunately nobody right now knows what's wrong with it or if it can actually be fixed. And since for nearly 31 years now the telescope has been in continuous operation in low Earth orbit, allowing us to see some of the most beautiful shots of the universe we've never been able to see before, I wanted to talk about some of the other historical missions that have previously repaired this telescope and to some extent allow NASA to acquire all of the prestige that it currently has today. But first of all, let's actually establish where exactly the telescope is located. NASA and a lot of other space agencies have a lot of different telescopes everywhere. Some of them, like the Chandra telescope that you see right here, have a relatively elliptical orbit around planet Earth. Other ones, like TESS that you see right here, have even stranger orbits, which also is one of the reasons why repairing something like this is going to be almost impossible, because it's almost impossible for any spacecraft to reach this, unless of course we have new rockets with new robotic technologies in order to repair all of this. But if you look closely around planet Earth, somewhere right here, you'll actually discover that Hubble telescope, unlike some of the previous telescopes, does not have a very unusual orbit. It simply orbits around planet Earth, at an average altitude of roughly around 550 kilometers. And because of its orbit, along with the initial designs, along with the construction of the telescope, to make it accessible from the outside and to make it very modular, the original engineers built this telescope to be repairable, they built it to be upgradable, and they also built it to be serviceable by astronauts in space. And so to some extent, Hubble telescope was almost like a test bed for a lot of new technologies in space that NASA was trying to test, including of course the ability of astronauts to build and to repair things in space. As a matter of fact, Hubble telescope was actually the main project that was supposed to test the ability of NASA and NASA astronauts to build something they referred to back then as the Space Station Freedom. Here's the concept art for what all of this would actually look like. And this is back from 1991. And the thing is, this might actually look somewhat familiar to you. As a matter of fact, it looks extremely familiar. It looks like something we already know. Something that's been orbiting the planet for the past few decades, the International Space Station. And that's mostly because the Space Station Freedom eventually, due to funding, was actually transformed into the International Space Station when the US government along with NASA realized that it was just way too expensive to build all of this alone, and they also decided to use this as a kind of an international opportunity to join forces together with Europe, with Japan, and also with Russia as well. And so even though the Russians were planning something known as Mir 2 station, while the Japanese and the European scientists were also trying to develop their own space stations as well, eventually the better solution was discovered when they decided to just collaborate and to build this thing together. And it of course worked so well, as we've discovered over the past few decades. But then originally when Hubble was finally launched by Space Shuttle Discovery back in 1990, it quickly became a major issue for NASA and for obviously US government, because there were a lot of problems with the mirror. There were also some major problems with the gyros and a lot of other components, and all of them started to degrade pretty quickly. And within only about a year or so, the NASA was basically sort of blamed for a lot of problems. As a matter of fact, their funding was almost taken away simply because of these major problems with Hubble. Here's one of the press conferences from the 90s that basically laid the blame for all of these poor pictures that Hubble was producing back then, that looked extremely blurry and were basically unusable. And because of this, NASA decided to create a very important mission to repair everything. They called this the Service Mission 1, and this mission was launched using the space shuttle, specifically the Mission 61, and all of this was launched approximately 3 years after. And this ended up being one of the most over-prepared space missions ever. For about 10 days, the astronauts were living in space. They worked really hard to repair the mirrors, to repair the gyros, to also add a lot of thermal insulating blankets. They also added a few major upgrades and boosted its orbit so that it can actually stay in orbit a little bit longer. So overall, this mission was a complete and resounding success, but also was an extremely important mission because NASA was trying to see if it was possible for the astronauts to repair things and to build things in space. The space station had to be built. And just like that, it was a resounding success. Service Mission 1 allowed NASA to recover their prestige, and pictures like this served as a reminder of how brilliant the NASA engineers really were. And this was of course the beginning of the NASA era, but also the beginning of the Hubble era. Since then, over the years, several other missions were able to service the telescope further. Most of the repairs were in regards to gyros that essentially allowed the telescope to turn around, but they also added a lot of upgrades while also improving the camera capabilities of the telescope itself. And so the second service mission, launched in 1997 or 4 years later, allowed the telescope to now see other parts of the light spectrum as well. Once again, huge success for NASA. And every time something failed, NASA jumped on this and repaired the telescope again. There was a service mission 3A and 3B back in 1999. Both missions were used to repair and upgrade the telescope even further. And so its modularity and its ability to be upgradable made this telescope absolutely incredible and definitely something that we've never had before in terms of technology. And it's actually probably one of the main reasons why nothing really comes even close to the ability that Hubble had. And so for the most part, all of these missions were going great, until of course the unfortunate disaster of the Space Shuttle Columbia that happened in 2003. Because the entire crew of the 107th Space Shuttle mission was lost, NASA now faced an extremely important decision. They were about to cancel the Space Shuttle program, which would also mean that Hubble telescope would no longer be repaired. And so for several years there was this struggle, to some extent I guess ideological struggle, between the need for science and the need for preserving human life. And for many years the administration didn't really know how to proceed. And of course, after a few years, the telescope started to malfunction again. And so several decisions had to be made. How would they repair the telescope? Would they use the space shuttle, maybe without the crew? Could they maybe use some sort of a robotic repair mechanism or something else to allow the scientists to do the work from the ground? And unfortunately, the answers were somewhat negative. No such technology existed back then and doesn't even exist right now. And so the scientists had to somehow convince NASA to launch one more repair mission. And they were able to do so after all. In 2009, NASA announced that they're going to be launching the Servicing Mission 4, the mission to give Hubble its final upgrade, to give its final repairs, and to try to give it as much of a boost as possible in terms of everything, to make it work for as long as it can. The mission itself was launched on May 11th, 2009, and of course proceeded as planned. Everything went perfectly well. A lot of new components were added, and even though there was an initial malfunction with some of the screws, with at least one screw getting unfortunately broken during the repair, the astronauts still found a way to repair absolutely everything and to upgrade everything they were planning to upgrade. And so the mission was a huge success, but this was essentially the last mission before the space shuttle was retired. Unfortunately, no other missions were planned simply because NASA found it to be too dangerous for the astronauts. And since then, no new technology or no new way has been found to either upgrade or to repair the telescope. And even though the original plans for the telescopes were to maybe retrieve it using the space shuttle and then to return it back to Earth and possibly put it on some exhibition such as the Smithsonian Museum, all of this now had to be cancelled. The telescope would most likely just stay orbiting around the planet, providing as much science as it could. But the scientists knew that one day it's going to break, and then it's going to be on a somewhat uncontrolled descent to planet Earth. And because NASA expected the telescope to one day break and have absolutely no control, they even attached this so-called soft capture mechanism, which is sort of like a ring-like device that is supposed to attach to some kind of a spacecraft that can then pull the telescope down to Earth so it doesn't actually crash on someone's house and cause some damage on the planet when it does return to the planet. In other words, it was a way for NASA to control the descent of the telescope when it's no longer operational. And interestingly, back in 2016, NASA officially signed the last service contract for Hubble, and it was supposed to last until June of 2021, which is really ironic because the telescope broke literally 2 weeks after. And as of now, nobody really knows what's wrong with it. The NASA engineers on Earth tried several things. At first, they suspected it was maybe a computer module, but because the telescope is built with a lot of redundancy, they tried the backup module just to get exactly the same error. Now, since this part has already experienced problems back in 2009 and had to be replaced back then, it would not actually be unusual for this part to be broken, but for both the backup computer and the main computer to experience the same error, that's not very likely, so NASA now believes the problem is actually somewhere else. And since other science instruments appear to function normally, and rebooting the computers, both the computers did not really do much, the engineers now believe that maybe it's something to do with the power module or the power regulator, and maybe some of the other parts in the command module as well. And so their goal now is to try to test and assess every individual part until either the error resolves itself or until they find a way to disable the broken parts and use the redundancy parts instead. But at the moment, after a few weeks, it really looks more and more like nothing is going to be repaired unless the 6th service mission happens. And honestly, at least from my perspective, the mission itself would be super important, not even just to repair the Hubble telescope, but because just like the Hubble telescope served as a kind of a platform to test various technologies in building the ISS, the Service Mission 6 might actually serve to propel us to a completely new level of possibly robotic missions to space stations and to various objects in space. And the reason I'm saying this is because it is very, very unlikely, practically impossible, for any kind of a manned mission to go and repair Hubble to happen. As a matter of fact, not only do we not have a spacecraft for this anymore, and there's really no specific capsule or no specific rocket that could do this very quick, there's unfortunately no interest or time to develop anything new that will allow us to repair Hubble either. However, this would be a perfect opportunity to develop some sort of a robotic platform that can then go to space on any modern rocket, even the ones from SpaceX, and use a combination of various technologies we possess here on the planet to try to repair the space telescope without an actual presence of any human next to it. Which means that this would be a perfect opportunity for either a private company or of course for NASA to jump on this and to try to develop something that will help us save not just Hubble telescope, but a lot of other different probes and different telescopes around the planet. And since our UAVs and our drones have already reached such a complexity that they're able to control themselves, they're able to do things autonomously, there's absolutely no reason or no excuse for anyone not to do this. There are a lot of companies that are more than capable of creating something incredible that will help us save the telescope. But assuming that we don't, what happens next? Well, NASA expects the telescope to potentially crash back into the planet between 2030 and 2040. It's going to be basically space junk. And unfortunately, if we end up losing Hubble telescope pretty much within a year after losing Arecibo Observatory, that's going to make me really sad on the inside. And I'm sure a lot of you will feel exactly the same. Although at least for the Arecibo Observatory, several other telescopes have already taken the same role in the last few months. For Hubble though, we don't really have anything better yet. James Webb Telescope is expected to launch in November of 2021, and even then it's not really going to serve exactly the same purpose. And so saving Hubble now and finding a way to repair it using some sort of a robotic technology would still probably be the best and possibly the cheapest answer. Which of course also highlights the importance of the space shuttle mission. Over the decades, this transformed our understanding of space, our understanding of how space technologies work, and propelled us to a completely new level of space exploration. But I guess until we develop something else, or until we hear more about what's happening with Hubble, that's pretty much all I wanted to mention. Subscribe if you still haven't, share this with someone who loves learning about space and sciences, and maybe come back tomorrow to learn something else. Maybe support this channel on Patreon by joining the channel membership, or by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt you can find in the description. Also, if you'd like to find out more about various space telescopes that NASA is using, or would like to explore various missions around planet Earth, check out the NASA's EYES application, which is absolutely free, and basically just find the telescope you'd like to learn more about, and then just click on it to zoom in and to get all of the information and all of the tours available in the application itself. Anyway, on that note, stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.